Disturbing stories from Italy, where virtually the entire nation is on lockdown. Just grocery stores and pharmacies are open to the public. Streets are relatively empty. And then there's this case, a woman under quarantine in the northwest of the country who's locked in her home with her husband who has died. Locals say she's shouting from her balcony for help. Her husband apparently died early in the morning Monday. The man had tested positive for coronavirus, and his body has been left in the apartment reportedly until it can be removed 48 hours after his death. Our next guest knows a thing or two about quarantine regulations here in the U.S. Former Deputy Assistant Attorney General John Yoo joins us live. John, good to have you back with us.
Hi, Shannon.
Okay, so let's start with schools, because there are people saying, I know you're a professor and you had to teach class online today, and people have had very different reactions about this. We want to put up the list of colleges and universities, and this is just sort of a list that continues to grow, but this is what we have so far of the schools who say, we're going to go to online classes for as long as we can. What do you make of that? Because we're told right now the social distancing, keeping people away from each other, is the one thing that may not stop the spread, but it may flatten it in a way that we don't have a huge spike that overwhelms our hospitals and they can't handle it.
Well, first thing we should ask is whether students are really in the population age range where we should be worried about. Doesn't seem to me that's the case. We really should be worried about the elderly, people with health conditions. Basically, college students are in pretty good shape and they're young. I can see why people might worry that they'll spread the disease to other people, maybe outside the university. But we should also be conscious of the costs we're imposing when we shut down universities. Classes aren't getting taught. As you said, I just taught my first internet class yesterday and today using Zoom. It really wasn't the same. Maybe you could give a lecture, but it's very hard to ask students questions. It's very hard for them to see us. Maybe they don't like the look of us anyway, but now we're at much farther distance from each other than we ever used to be. I think it's hard to have a discussion to really learn on the internet still.
Okay, so let's talk about this idea of quarantine. I mean, we have right now a containment zone in one area just outside New York City. But this idea of quarantines, it seems like we continue to hear stories every day of people who are, quote unquote, breaking them. They're going to the store, they're going to their kids' schools, they're doing what they want to do. I mean, Americans, I think that they're going to have a hard time responding to some of this stuff, but it may be necessary. What can you tell us about how it would work?
Yeah, and this comes from my time in the government after 9/11 when we were worried about a bioterror attack. The people should realize that the federal government really only has control over the international borders and the borders between states. The federal government doesn't have the money and personnel to really carry out a quarantine within a state. Take California or New York. That's got to be done under our Constitution by the state governments. They're going to see a real test of different states and how capable they are and how effective they were in planning for an event like this. So you couldn't have one national solution like you saw in China or what you're seeing maybe in Italy. You're going to see lots of different states doing different things, but they're the ones who have to take on the front lines of a quarantine and fight this pandemic.
Is it something that happens under state law? I mean, would they have authority, or could there be criminal penalties, civil penalties for people who don't obey these if we really get to that point?
That's a great question, Shannon. Again, it's up to each state. Some states could go far and try to impose some kind of criminal sanction. They could call out their National Guard units, perhaps even, and try to use even force to try to prevent people from leaving their homes. But I don't think that's the American way. I don't think people would stand for those kind of controls. We have a very individualistic society compared to those other countries. You could see lawsuits. You could see resistance to some kind of heavy-handed use of force. We are a country where everybody pays their taxes voluntarily. I expect most Americans would not need that level of coercion, that they would voluntarily follow quarantine orders and restrictions on their travel.
Well, we'll see. We know incoming travel from Europe is going to be restricted to the U.S., most of Europe for now. We'll watch and see how the states, especially those hardest hit, handle this. A lot of you folks out there on the West Coast, we're pulling for you, John. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Shannon.